from these big guys. So their fur, their skin, their feet from Siberian permafrost mummies. None of that from our Columbian mammoths. But that is going to bring me here to our mural. So this is our Columbian mammoth male, and this is as life size as we can get him. And by that I mean he's about 14 feet tall at the shoulder there, though he's 6 inches shorter than he's supposed to be because those lights were there first, and that's a safety issue. He would have weighed about 20,000 pounds in life, or like a school bus full of kids, and we think he would have eaten 700 pounds of grass per day. That's like one of those hay bales that you see on the side of the road as you drive on past. And if you are curious, we estimate he would have washed that down with 50 to 80 gallons of water. Quite a lot, right? So what does it take to recreate a mammoth of this scale? Honestly, a lot of educated guesswork. So how do we know he would have had a trunk, tusks, fur? How do we know what color that fur was? More guesses. Now we can safely assume that he had a trunk and tusks. He is a proboscidean or an elephant relative. Now the exact length of that trunk we of course don't know unless we find one down here in our dig site or in some Alaskan permafrost. As for his fur, however, we know that woolly mammoths had a thick layer of fur. Meanwhile, modern day elephants are like you and I, where they have a sparse coating of hair. So we kind of put them somewhere in the middle, but we'll get to that in just a sec. That fur color, on the other hand, well, I did tell a little bit of a fib. We do have some soft tissue preservation from these guys, but it is a single hair. A single hair from a cave in Arizona by the name of Bishan. This is a Dene or Navajo word meaning big poop. Now, if you can imagine what they found in this cave, it's because these guys were using it like a bathroom. So in a single specimen of Columbian mammoth dung, or a coprolite as we call it, we find a single Columbian mammoth hair. It's very red in color. We don't know if this is because it was highly oxidized or if that was its true color, but we do know that woolly mammoths can be blonde, brown, and red. So we mixed all three of those for whatever reason to get this big guy behind me. Now as for his sick mullet, because I know you're all wondering, that's so you know he's from Texas. Bad joke, I know. Plenty more coming on the tour. You can get your refunds back up at the Welcome Center, like I said. So this is actually our interpretation of a mammoth shedding. He's living in cold places like Alaska and Canada, where it's covered in ice and snow relatively year-round, but he's also living here in Texas and even further south into Panama, where there was no ice. Because yes, Ice Age Texas was ice-free, if you can believe it, and we know this from our fossil record. In North America, we had the Ice Age, and this was denoted by the glacial sheets, the Laurentide and Cordilleran. Now we know that they extended no further south than about the middle of Kansas, which is part of why we know that Texas was ice-free. But before we get on to that, though, some modern size comparison. A modern-day Asian elephant is going to walk up to about his chin or his cheek here. A woolly mammoth up to about his eyeball. And a modern-day African elephant bull up to the middle of his ears or his forehead. Now, speaking of those ears, anything weird you might notice? They're pretty small, right? Especially for an animal of this size. Well, we know that woolly mammoths from those Siberian permafrost examples, they have ears no bigger than yours and mine. They're living in cold places where if their ear's too big, it's going to freeze and snap right off. Modern day elephants, on the other hand, they're living in hotter places like southern Africa and the subtropics of India. They need these huge, floppy ears full of blood vessels for thermal regulation or temperature control. So they're using them to radiate excess heat out into their environment and to use as fans to cool down when hot. So we gave this guy a bit of a medium ear to once again satisfy he's living in cold and warm places, small enough that it hopefully doesn't freeze and fall off on an Alaskan vacation, and large enough that he's got a fan for Saturday game day. Hook him. Now, if there was no ice in Ice Age Texas, what was it looking like when he was walking around? Honestly, not too much different than what we just walked through outside today, perhaps even of a similar temperature. We do know that Ice Age Texas could still get to temperatures of 80 and 90 degrees in the summer, so it would have been pretty temperate, pretty warm, but it also would have been less forested. So what Central Texas is nowadays is a live oak woodland, a mesquite shrubland, and alluvial floodplain. Many fancy words to describe what we are. Back then, however, we would have been more like a grassland. And if you turn your attention to this mural here behind you, we've tried to recreate over Pleistocene Texas. Now this right here is something we call a savanna. That is a grassland with about 30% tree coverage, and prairie grass is anywhere from 4 to 6 feet tall. But this is great for our mammoths because grass is all that they eat. They're like really big calves. On the other hand, we think they weren't just here for food. We suspect that they were also here for water. About half a mile from our site is the confluence or the meeting point of the Brazos and the Bosque rivers, two major water sources throughout Central Texas. We also know that just beneath our fossil bed here is a water table, or a bed of gravel that groundwater is consistently running through year-round. From our fossil record, we know that this is some type of natural spring-fed water in Boulder Creek, or at least just some very rich area. So because of that, all that water, it's going to be growing all this grass and all these plants that herbivores love, and where there's a free buffet, you'll find carnivores. Now speaking of, we do have some Ice Age friends here in the dig site that I will point out to you guys. Now I'll just steal this window right here from you. First and foremost, we have our even-toed mammal in that back wall that you see. He's going to be these ribs right here against the wall and on this pedestal right here. So even-toed mammal, that's really descriptive, I know. He would have been called that because he had two hoof-like projections on his feet. This could have been anything from a camel to a cow to a deer to a pronghorn to an antelope, a very wide range of mammals in Artiodactyla. However, based on their size and structure and the region that they are found in, we suspect this is an area. That this might have been an ancestor of a modern white-tailed deer or some type of antelope. However, until we find more of him back on that shelf, we just don't know for sure. Y'all are here at a great time though, because just a few years ago he was still labeled our unknown mammal, so at least we know this much. Beneath him, however, is going to be our only concrete evidence of a carnivore on this site, and that is our saber-toothed cat tooth. Right over here, so he's going to be that small, tiny tooth right there on that white box. And that tooth is about as long as your pinky finger, meaning he is less of a saber-toothed cat and more of a saber-toothed kitten. That is a juvenile canine tooth. Just like you and me, he would have had a juvenile and an adult set of teeth in his skull at some point in his life. We don't quite know why this little guy dropped his tooth here. It might have been a natural shed. We don't have any other remains from this cat, just his tooth, and we also don't have any footprints. So it could have been something like biting down on something too hard, or a sip from our slow-moving water was enough to knock it out. Regardless, that is a really big mistake to the tooth fairy, if you ask me. We also don't quite know what species this cat is. We had Smilodon fatalis here in this region, which would have been the largest of the saber-toothed cats, but we also had several members of the genus Homotherium, the scimitar-toothed cats. And if we were in the right time period, we also had the Nimravides, another lineage of scimitar-toothed cat. So we don't quite know, and we can't quite tell from that juvenile tooth. Beneath our saber-toothed cat, however, is our most special guest on site, and that is our lovely western camel down here on the floor. So it might be weird to think of a camel in Texas. Trust me, I get it. But if you're familiar with the story of the Eocene horse, just like horses, camellias would have originally evolved here in North America. They would have started from ancestors about the size of a house cat or a small dog before going into the gargantuan sizes that we are familiar with today. Cousins of our western camel, they would eventually move across that Bering Land Bridge between Alaska and Asia, becoming the modern Bactrian and dromedary camels that we know of today in places like the Gobi Desert and the Sahara. Other cousins of our western camel, they would move into South America, into the Andes Mountains, becoming alpacas, llamas, guanacos, and vicuñas. If you see a camel in Texas today, it is most likely a reintroduced dromedary camel from some type of crazy camel farmer. Those are pretty chill people though, if you ask me. However, we like to point out our camel for two reasons. Number one is a bit of an imagination exercise. Do we think she had a hump? We do not. So those humps that you see on modern day camels, they are desert adaptations. They're living in really harsh environments where they're going for days up to a couple of weeks at a time without proper food and water. They need those humps as a fat store or a nutrient store. Our camel here, well, she's living in Pleistocene, Texas, where it's a lot more temperate. She has a lot more food and water at her disposal, and most likely did not need that hump. However, I will make the disclaimer, if it helps you to visualize her as a giant dromedary camel with a hump, because she would have been a couple feet taller, by all means, please do. I don't like to discourage your creativity. But the other reason that we point out our camel is because she's on the same layer of dirt and therefore from a similar time period as our nursery herd, and that is going to bring me down here to Mammoth S. So Mammoth S down here we know is part of that nursery herd. There were the 16 individuals found outside with a few more found in here for 19, 7 juveniles, 12 adults. And we know that Mammoth S is a part of them through a process called dating. Now I'm not talking Tinder dating or finding a cute classmate. I'm talking the scientific process of carbon dating. We get asked pretty frequently if we've dated our bones. Sorry, you guys. And we have tried. These guys are just a bit too old. So carbon dating, it's good up until about 15,000 years or so before the carbon sample then becomes too small and degraded to really be read any further back, basically meaning there's no more organic material. In our case, we've used something different and more powerful, and on our site, OSL, optically stimulated luminescence. This is a fancy way of saying we take a sample of dirt from around our bones and we make sure it sees no sunlight on its way out that can contaminate the sample. We're going to take it to a lab where we slip it beneath a microscope, and it's at that point that we are looking for silica crystals or sand-like particulate within the dirt sample, specifically crystals made of quartz. Quartz, fun fact if you didn't already know, it is a conductor. It can also hold on to energy. So what we're looking for here is how it holds on to UV radiation from the sun. Much like a sample of uranium that has a half-life and will slowly decay over time, these crystals slowly leach that energy away. And basically what we're doing is counting how much is left to see the last time it ever saw natural sunlight, aka the time at which it was deposited and covered up by more dirt. Now we know from OSL dating that our nursery herd and camel are approximately 65,000 years old. Now I'm an archaeologist and an anthropologist by trade. This means that I deal in human material rather than faunal, which is what a lot of our paleontologists do here. I always like to tell my visitors that there were no humans in North America at the time of our nursery herd, at least not that we know of. We know that humans were here in North America about 14,000 years ago, confirmed some fanciful estimates ranging from 17 to 40,000 years old. So none of these guys would have ever seen great-great-grandpa throw a spear, but let's be honest, that's probably for the best. So if it wasn't human hunting though, why do we have this many mammoths here on this site? 19 members of a nursery herd, first and foremost, same spot, same place, dying all at once. Well, there are two hypotheses here on site, and I will start with the original one first. When we were first discovered between two rivers and a creek bed, it was thought that there might have been some type of flash flood or mudslide event that swept our nursery herd away. That gets a little easier to believe when you realize that elephants can't really swim, number one, and number two, elephants are some of the few mammals on this earth that cannot jump. Those big pillar-like legs of theirs, they're not made for jumping, and they would probably hurt themselves if they tried. So if they're caught in really deep water or thick mud, they might have a hard time getting out of it if they can't simply walk. However, we have done some geochemical studies here in the building on the soil, and we have seen no evidence of flash flooding or mudslide here in the building. We would see a different soil composition. It would be in larger chunks rather than fine silt. We would also see things like different chemical oxygen levels. We would see large rocks carried by the weight of the mud or water, large tree trunk chunks. We don't really see any of this in our stratigraphy or the layers of the earth. So that just made us question further, again, why are they here? If it wasn't human hunting or a flood or a mudslide, well, Mammoth S is gonna be my helper here today. I'm gonna steal this window from you guys now, I do apologize. So, you might notice that Mammoth S is labeled a juvenile, a bit of an odd segue, I know. But what we're really gonna look at right now is gonna be her long bones. So your long bones are gonna be femur, humerus, radius ulna, tibia, fibia, those bones of your limbs. At the ends of these long bones, we have things called epithelial or growth plates. If you're a juvenile in this room beneath the age of 17 or 18, your growth plates are not fully fused because you still have to get big and strong. However, if you're an adult like me, your growth plates are fully fused because you don't have to get any bigger. And in fact, the older we get, the more we shrink. So Mammoth S down here, her growth plates, they're fully fused. This means that she's a grown adult. We just have yet to change her sign. But if that's the case, she is extremely small for her age. On further reflection, multiple of our nursery herd adults were seen to be small for their ages. So that's a bit of a ponder, right? Is this a genetic mutation? Is this a subspecies thing? What's going on? Why are they so small? Well, taking a closer look, we saw that many of their bones displayed signs of pitting. This tells us that their bones are reabsorbing their own calcium and their own nutrients, and this is usually a hallmark indicator of something like malnutrition. Rather than too much water, such as in the event of a flood or a mudslide, we suspect there might not have been enough. Something like long-term drought, an event which Texas is no stranger to, even thousands of years ago. So these nursery herds are going to be led around their grazing ranges by their matriarchs. These are the oldest females in the herd, something like grandma or great-grandma. And now elephants are smart, right? They have a very good memory. So they have all this generational knowledge passed down to them from their own forebears about the best spots for food and water, the safest spots to hang out, and the dangerous spots to avoid. So they're going around and coming up dry time and time again, looking for this food and water. And grandma remembers, hey, this used to be a really nice watering hole, a really nice spring. Let's go there as a last resort. We're feeling a little desperate. They get here and either find no water and dead grass, certainly not enough to sustain a herd of their size, or they could have gotten here and found something like stagnant water, full of deadly algae and toxic bacteria. They're going to take a sip and get sick and can't recover because they are immunely compromised or because they were physically weak from being malnourished and exhausted walking around. They might have slowly laid down to be comfortable and passed slowly from something like starvation or dehydration. Now, I do mention laying down for a reason, and that is because all of our nursery herd members, including the camel, have been found laying on their sides. If we look down here at Mammoth S's spine, she's got her spinous processes sticking straight only towards the wall and down towards the floor. This tells us not only is she on her side, but also that this was most likely a slow death. Had she been in a flood or a mudslide, a rather sudden occurrence, if you can imagine, she likely would have been carried into a more spontaneous position. Something like on her back, her stomach, or having a leg flailed out fabulously to strike a pose that we don't see with any of our individuals here on site. On top of that, we see many signs of scavenging on their bones. Things like canine tooth markings, rodent teeth scratches, dermestid beetles picking at the flesh. They leave markings on the bones sometimes, little pieces of microwear. So when we see things like that, it tells us that they were most likely exposed to the elements for long enough post-death that they could be scavenged from. Flooding victims, mudslide victims, they tend to be covered instantaneously by large layers of sediment, debris, or other contaminants, keeping them away from predators and scavengers. With this evidence as of 2025, our prevailing hypothesis is going to be long-term drought. However, we won't fully discredit that flooding hypothesis just because if any of you guys are fellow Texans, then you know that when we've been dry for a long period of time and suddenly get heavy storms, flash flooding is an incredibly common behavior for this region. This could have been any number of things as well, or multiple factors contributing to their death. Something like a dry spell, sudden rain, and maybe similar to the tar pits of La Brea, there was a thick layer of soft mud that they stepped into and couldn't pull themselves out of. We just have a lot of things that we have yet to puzzle out. Any questions about our nursery herd or our camel? If not, I will move on to our adult male here, the elephant in the room, quite literally. So if you recall me saying there are no adult males in a nursery herd, so why is this guy down here? Well, you might notice he's about 2 to 3 feet higher in the fossil bed than everybody else. That 2 to 3 feet of dirt is approximately 14,000 years worth of time difference. So the simple answer is that he is not part of the nursery herd. He came many years later. Where our nursery herd and camel are about 65,000 years old, Mammoth Hughes about 51,000. So he would have never seen our nursery herd or even sniffed him. We don't even think he's related to them. However, these guys are in such poor condition that we can't get DNA from them anyways. But that still makes us ask the question, why is he here? From our fossil record, we know that this was still a very active area for water and food, so he was probably here for a sip or a snack. However, he's in a very sudden death position, and we know this because he is on his stomach. This right here is his spine, with his spinous processes sticking straight up towards the ceiling, and his 2 back legs kind of sprawled out behind him. He is a fossilized faceplant, and we aren't entirely sure why. From his teeth, we know he's at an advanced age. He's in his late 40s to early 50s. This is highly unusual for a male mammoth, so it might have just been his time, or he took his morning jog, slipped, fell over, couldn't get back up, there was no prehistoric life alert to help him, or he might have had some underlying condition that we don't see preserved on his bones. I've been asked about things like osteoporosis, arthritis. These often leave signs on the skeletal structure, which we would call pathologies. We don't see those on Mammoth Hughes remains here. I've also been asked about things like aneurysm or cardiac arrest, both very sudden conditions. If that's the case, they do not preserve on bone, and we wouldn't know for sure. However, he does have something cool I can point out, and that's going to be this softball-sized growth right here on his rib. Now that softball-sized growth is about 6 to 18 months worth of bone regrowth and healing from some type of break or fracture. We suspect about a year's worth. However, that does beg the question, how does a 14-foot tall, 20,000-pound mammal get a broken rib all the way up here near his spine? Because it's about here on his body. Any good suggestions? Fighting, any others? Well, to all of you guys that said fighting, we do think that's the most likely answer. So, mammoth males, they're going to turn the age of 13 to 15, and they're going to go through puberty. They're also going to experience their first rut known as musk. They get highly aggressive, and well, mama don't want to deal with that no more. So boys are going to get kicked from the nursery herd to go make their own decisions in life. Things like sneaking into R-rated movies and listening to heavy metal. Self-diss, I love heavy metal. But they're out there living that sweet bachelor life, and they are looking for food, water, a girlfriend, and fighting about all 3 of those things. Those tusks that you see down there on Mammoth Q, they're about 11 feet long and weigh 250 to 300 pounds each of pure ivory. When 2 male mammoths fight, we think it's going to be like 2 male elephants, where they lock their tusks together in a headbutt motion, trying to either cause damage or to get one another to back down to see who wins or who loses. If those tusks become unlocked, they're going to start swinging into each other's skulls and sides, and at that point, that is the world's largest baseball bat, straight to the rib. This is a common injury that we see not only in male mammoths in our fossil record at sites like ours, but also our sister site in Hot Springs, South Dakota. They are a natural entrapment zone, a sinkhole, and they have 61 or more individuals layered one on top of the other, found alone over thousands upon thousands of years. Many of them have been diagnosed male, and many of them have this same injury but in slightly different spots. We also see it in male elephants today, telling us it is most likely from intraspecific competition or competition between males. So then, how do we know that Mammoth Q is male for sure? Some people ask about the tusks. Is it because they're longer or they're more curved? Yes and no. We do have outliers. Sometimes females get really long tusks, sometimes males have short ones. But what we're really going to look at here is going to be the pelvis. So you can do this with any mammal, humans included, though ours are a little bit funky since we're bipedal, or walk on 2 legs, I should say. But down here, Mammoth Q is a deer, and he preserved both halves of his pelvis for us. And what we're really looking at here is that small circular-shaped opening. Now, if you're a male in this room, you also have a small opening to your pelvis, and that is not an insult but a truth, because you don't have to push out babies at any point in your lifetime. Females, on the other hand, in the human case, have a much larger, oval-shaped opening to the pelvis, or in our mammoth's case, a huge diamond. Because again, at some point in their life, whether they did or did not, they might have had to push out a big old mammoth calf, which would have been the size of a small cow at birth. Any questions about mammoth Q down here?
Is there any difference in hip width or torso length between the sexes?
Any difference in hip width or torso length between sexes? Hip width, possibly. We do know that mammoth Q's pelvis is going to be quite a bit smaller than mammoth W, who I'll show you guys here in just a minute. Her pelvis is a lot larger and a lot wider and a little bit flatter. And then she has that big old diamond-shaped opening. Now about torso length, I'm not entirely sure, but that is a great question. Stump the ranger on that one. Any others?
So both the male and female had tusks?
Yes, sir. Just like elephants today. At least with African elephants, we
The
do know that
Indian
females.
elephants don't have.
Yeah, the Indian elephants don't have. The females don't have the tusks. But yes, we do know that both male and female did have them. Any others? If not, I will move us on to the other half.